Welcome everyone. In today's video we're going to be learning about rhombuses, rectangles, and squares, which are types of special parallelograms. You're probably familiar with what a rhombus looks like, perhaps, what a rectangle looks like, what a square looks like, but today we're going to learn some of the specific qualifications for those shapes to be called rhombuses, rectangles, and squares. Now the first thing we're going to do is review a quick concept that we learned previously. So let's jump in and do that. Previously, we learned about what makes a shape a parallelogram. So a parallelogram will have 5 special qualities. First of all, the opposite sides will be parallel. We can see that those two opposite sides here are marked parallel, and then these two opposite sides are marked parallel. It will also have congruent opposite sides, and we can see the tick marks on segment AB and segment DC marking them congruent, and segment AD and segment BC are marked congruent. They will also have congruent opposite angles. So we can see that angle DAB is marked congruent to angle BCD, and angle ABC is marked congruent to angle ADC. Also, they'll have supplementary consecutive angles. Now, it's difficult to mark this on a diagram. What this would mean is that, for instance, angle BAD and angle ADC, they're consecutive angles. They would be supplementary or add up to 180 degrees. And then the diagonals would also bisect each other. So the diagonals, remember, connect opposite corners in our shape. So point A to point C, that segment is a diagonal, and segment BD is a diagonal. And for them to bisect each other, it means that each diagonal cuts the other one into 2 equal parts. And we can see how segment AE and segment EC are congruent, and segment BE and segment DE are congruent. So that's what makes a parallelogram special. But now let's look at a rhombus. Let's see what makes a shape perhaps qualify as a rhombus. So a rhombus has all the properties of a parallelogram plus 2 additional properties. First of all the sides are congruent. And you can see on this diagram here, all of these sides are congruent. And in this other diagram, we can see the special qualification, the second special qualification of a rhombus, in that the diagonals will be perpendicular. They will form a 90-degree angle. So every rhombus will have all the properties of a parallelogram plus these 2 additional true properties. Now a rectangle, again, is probably a shape that we're familiar with, but technically what are the properties that a rectangle has? Well, it has all the 5 properties of a parallelogram that we addressed a few minutes ago, plus all the angles are 90-degree angles. So not only are the opposite angles congruent and the consecutive angles supplementary, but they're all the same measure. And what's going to end up happening in a rectangle is that they would all be 90 degrees. And that's because all 4 of them have to add up to 360. So if they're congruent and add up to 360, they each have to be 90 degrees. The second special property of a rectangle is that the diagonals will be congruent. So each of these diagonals, going from one corner to the opposite corner, is the same length. Now we can see the way that this typically gets marked on a diagram is that each diagonal is broken into 2 parts, and then each part is congruent. We can see that from here to this intersection point of the 2 diagonals, and from this corner to that intersection point, from this corner to that intersection point, and from this corner to that intersection point, all of those parts are congruent. So when you piece together two of those parts to make one full diagonal, it would be the same length as if we pieced the other 2 parts together to make the other full diagonal. Now that's a rectangle. Let's talk about the final special type of parallelogram, which is a square. And a square has all the properties of a parallelogram plus all the properties of a rhombus. So it's going to have all sides congruent, as we see in this first square. It has over here we have perpendicular diagonals. And then it's going to have all the properties of a rectangle as well. So it'll have all angles that are 90 degrees and diagonals that are congruent. And that's what makes it a square. So it kind of has 9 special properties, the 5 from a parallelogram, the 2 from a rhombus, and the 2 from a rectangle. So there we have it. You've probably learned about rhombuses, rectangles, and squares, or learned to identify what they look like. But now you know some of the specific geometric properties of those shapes.